Welcome to Vantage Points. I'm Hisham Maligi. Tonight we have a special episode with two experts on a topic that is still emotional, of course, but I'm hoping that we will discuss it in a more factual, balanced, and calm way to bring about some better understanding and hopefully a better future for all of us based on this understanding. The topic is, of course, 9/11. 9/11 will turn 19 this coming week, and a lot has been done under the name and the guise and the excuse of 9/11. Of course, you know about the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the wars that followed. Of course, you know about the Patriot Act. Of course, you know about the surveillance and so much so forth that is being excused under the guise of keeping us safe and secure. So I will bring tonight's guests into the studio and I will ask them to introduce themselves. With me is Dr. Kevin Barrett and engineer Enver Masaud. Welcome to Vantage Points. Thank you very much for coming on the show and looking forward to having a great discussion with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Dr. Barrett, go ahead and introduce yourself for the audience, please.
Well, I'm Kevin Barrett. I'm at this point age 61, and I've missed out on the last, what should have been almost 15 years of teaching Islamic studies and literature and folklore at the university level, because in the years after 2003 and 4, I got involved in Scholars for 9/11 Truth, which was the academic wing of the 9/11 Truth movement. So while I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin in 2006, I was nominated essentially as the whipping boy for Scholars for 9/11 Truth by Fox News and Lynn Cheney and Karl Rove of the Bush administration. And they wanted to stop the professors from talking about 9/11 Truth. There were about 100 of us signed on to Scholars for 9/11 Truth. They decided that I would be a good person to attack on Fox News. And the politicians, some Republicans here in Wisconsin, demanded that I should be fired from the University of Wisconsin because of what I had said about 9/11 on a radio show. And what I had said is that it was indeed a false flag event. So I fought back. And I won in terms of staying at the University of Wisconsin for one more semester, but I lost my academic career because after that, I became toxic in the American world of universities. So ever since then, I've been an author, journalist, and troublemaker.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Engineer Masaud, go ahead, please.
Well, I'm an electrical, industrial engineer, computer science OR. I worked 12 years for Oklahoma Gas and Electric. I was the first foreigner they hired. I became their long-range planning engineer. I went on to the Department of Energy, where I managed the U.S. National Power Grid Study, the National Electrical Reliability Study, and soon became persona non grata because I refused to bend to the politics. I then went on to the Iowa Commerce Commission, where I was responsible for trying to make the electric, telephone, gas utilities more productive. We were doing great there. In fact, there was an editorial written by the editor of the major newspaper in Iowa, who then ended up as the ombudsman at the Washington Post. Cut a long story short, I did jobs with the World Bank, USAID, Norwegian Development Bank in several countries, including Russia, Pakistan, Indonesia, a few African countries. I was living in Arlington, Virginia, when 9/11 happened, right next to the Pentagon, literally a short walk to the Pentagon. And I was in the shower when my neighbor called me and told me what was happening. Maybe that's enough of an introduction.
Thank you. I think it's safe to say that you don't often wear a tinfoil hat. Let's just put it this way. It is very unfortunate that when someone raises the issue of 9/11, unfortunately, it's as if we are programmed. Okay, conspiracy theory, this and that. Both of you are established in academia and in government and engineering. And so, I mean, what drove you into this topic of 9/11? Why is it important? Why did you feel compelled to look into it even from the get-go? Dr. Barrett.
Well, I was teaching Islamic studies this was kind of just as I was finishing my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in the early 2000s. So when 9/11 happened, my first response was, this looks kind of suspicious. I wouldn't be surprised if insiders and or Israelis were involved, but we'll probably never know. So I just more or less accepted that this would be even worse than the Kennedy assassination, which I had studied long ago and had determined was obviously a coup d'etat in the United States, as 2/3 of the American people know. So I finished my PhD in 2004, I think it was. But it was right as I was finishing my PhD that I heard that David Ray Griffin, who was a very eminent professor, was about to publish a book arguing that the World Trade Center had been blown up with explosives, that the Pentagon had not been attacked by a hijacked jetliner piloted by a man who was incompetent to pilot Cessna training aircraft, and so on. And I looked at that and said, really, David Ray Griffin? He thinks that? I'd better look into it. And so I did, and I discovered that David was right. And that threw me for a loop. I've been a Muslim since 1993, and I could see that this was launching a global war on Islam, and that a lot of people were going to be hurt and killed, and that this was going to be used to roll back freedom in the United States in a huge way. And the scale of this lie was just atrocious. So I was very angry, and I was faced with a choice of either keeping my mouth shut for 7 years and trying to get tenure, or just being honest and telling the truth about it. So I resolved to tell the truth. I started doing teach-ins at the university, and that's what's led me on the road to becoming a notorious 9/11 conspiracy theorist, as the mainstream calls me, or a leader of the truth movement, as I've sometimes been called by people who are more sympathetic.
Thank you. And Mr. Masaud, what brought you into the 9/11 topic?
Well, when it first happened, I just believed everything I was being told on television. I had no questions at the moment, because it's such a huge event. It sort of blows your mind, and you're not thinking straight for a few hours or a few days or a few years.
Right.
And I started coming across bits and pieces of information that raised questions in my mind. Mind you, I'm a planning engineer, and my whole training is in taking lots of different pieces of information and using them to decide what to do about the future. So the skills that I developed there are very useful in this area. And I ended up writing my first article on the subject on April 27th, I believe, 2002. Basically raising a bunch of questions and why I was questioning it. So that was the beginning of my education, self-education. Well, I shouldn't say self, because there are literally hundreds of people that were also putting out information.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of my questioning.
Right.
It led to another, and I think it was about 8 years later that I came out with my first book on the subject. Here it is, 9/11 Unveiled.
Right.
Download free from the internet.
On twf.org.
Well, just Google it, 9/11 Unveiled free book, and you'll end up with the link.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much. So I'll share with you the beginning of also. I mean, it's very interesting how you came to 9/11. On the same year, on 2001, Ramadan was later than September. I forgot, it was maybe November, December, something like that. And I was attending an iftar event, which is the dinner event, like breaking the fast, in Brooklyn. I'm originally, like, I live in Staten Island. The 20 years I've been in the United States. one of the guests was speaking about, and this is what, like, I was busy and hungry and eating and this and that, and the guy was talking, and this perked my ears, like, and I basically sat up in my seat when he said the following: my boss, and he said the name of the boss. I don't want to take us away by the name of the boss. He's controversial, but my boss was live on the radio at the time that the Twin Towers were being attacked. And he said at the time that they will blame this on Osama bin Laden, but we know that he has no capability of doing something like that. I'm very little paraphrasing in what I'm saying here, but basically the guy was right then and there, and this was like a jolt in my body. What? An American academician saying something like that? And it made me start looking into this information. At the time, Muslims were, I mean, you can imagine, we were living in extreme fear. People were being picked up by the FBI and even the local police, disappearing, detained or deported or this and that. And for someone, and the radio, for example, the TV and radio were nonstop attacks on Islam and Muslim. And I remember Sean Hannity particularly was very big on that. So this was like a jolt that made me, okay, so there might be a different story here. I've really never known much about Osama bin Laden or his activity or abilities or geopolitics and stuff. So it made me delve into a phase of research, history, economics, politics, you name it, everything. And I came up with two questions, and I'm hoping that the rest of this episode will be discussing or delineating these two issues: why 9/11 happened and why the reaction to it happened that way. So let's talk now about the event itself. Do you want to talk about the actual chronology of things? I mean, it's up to you. You teach us what you've been doing.
Why 9/11 happened, I'm sure Kevin Barrett, Dr. Barrett knows this too. There was a so-called Project for the New American Century that has clues in it. And that was put together by the neocons for Benjamin Netanyahu. And when Bush came into office, the younger Bush, it was presented to him in a revised format. And basically what it said is we need to put more money into the military, and we need to control the energy resources in Central Asia and the Middle East. But to get the American people behind us, I'm paraphrasing, we need a new Pearl Harbor. In fact, that's the title of one of Professor David A. Griffin's books, which Dr. Barrett mentioned earlier. That's
the new Pearl Harbor.
I want to add one other question about conspiracy theories. You know, if you search the legal the equivalent of Google, I think it's Westlaw, conspiracies will occur hundreds and hundreds of times. Conspiracies all around us. There's nothing rare about a conspiracy. The question is not whether it's a conspiracy. We know it was a conspiracy because two or more people planning in a secret to commit a crime is a conspiracy.
Right.
Question is, do the facts support the conspiracy theory?
Is there evidence?
Yeah. And the official conspiracy theory is the 9/11 Commission report, and the facts don't support them.
So you mentioned also like that term conspiracy theory. I know you wrote about it and how it came to our lexicon. You want to explain that part?
How
the term conspiracy theory came into the lexicon?
I'll be able to answer that better, but oh yes, I remember. In fact, I have a memo from the FBI to their staff saying that to discredit people looking into the Kennedy assassination, people like Dr. Barrett, call them conspiracy theorists.
It was actually the CIA, Enver.
Was a CIA memo?
CIA memo, yeah. At that time, in 1966 or 7, Jim Garrison, the district attorney for New Orleans, Louisiana, was mounting a very serious investigation into the real killers of President Kennedy. And that was basically an intelligence world overlapping with the mafia. And he was going after them. And he would have gotten them, except that his key witnesses all dropped dead and the media smeared him. So at that time, the CIA put out a memo to all of its assets in the media, ordering them to attack Garrison and everybody else who was questioning the official story of the Warren Commission report by calling them a conspiracy theorist. So that's where the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist entered the general lexicon. It was thanks to a CIA memo.
And this memo is available?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I don't have the number in front of me, but I can send you the link to articles about that. There's a good one by Professor James Tracy that's up at Global Research, and there are many others. That memo has been declassified. You can actually read the CIA telling its journalists on its payroll, we call them prostitutes, to start calling people conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, I have that memo at the Wisdom Fund website, twf.org. It's got handwritten notes in the margins. Mm-hmm. And spells out point by point how to attack the so-called conspiracy theorists.
And when you say assets in the media, I've watched the show Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman a few years ago, and there was this German journalist, and he was talking about how the CIA basically controls key people in key publications in a way that it basically control the narrative globally, or in also, again, key places. Is that what you're talking about by assets? And can you say more about it?
Yes. The book. Yeah, you're talking about Udo Ufkult, and the book is entitled "Prostitutes: Embedded in the Pay of the CIA." I believe that's the one that you're talking about, anyway. And that's he was talking about Europe, where the CIA has bought many journalists, but even here in the United States, Carl Bernstein, the famous Watergate journalist, published an article in Rolling Stone pointing out that hundreds of American journalists, editors, and publishers are basically bought, or in some cases they volunteered for the CIA. And this has been going on since the 1950s, when Operation Mockingbird was established. Operation Mockingbird was considered the most successful CIA program ever, and its founder, Cord Meyer, was decorated as the founder of the most successful CIA program ever. Now, Operation Mockingbird's purpose was to influence and buy and control American journalists. And so they had hundreds of journalists on their payroll. And to this day, one never really knows whether mainstream journalists are moonlighting for the CIA or for other intelligence agencies.
Right. So, okay. So, I mean, assuming, let's say that this is still happening, so the coverage of 9/11 could basically be that they are, those prostitutes, as you label them, could be doing moonlighting for the military-industrial complex plans in order to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and so much so forth. Is that the line of thinking here?
I think it's that plus more. There isn't like one group controlling all the journalists.
Mm-hmm.
The journalists are looking out for where their bread is buttered and who's paying them.
Right.
You're talking about bosses earlier. Somebody's boss said that 9/11 happened because of such and such. President Trump, I've got him saying that those towers could not have come down by themselves. I've got him on talking to Fox News in New York on the day of 9/11. That's President Trump himself.
Okay, so I'm going to be doing a lot of devil's advocate work here because, of course, of the nature of the topic that we're talking about. So I want factual things that we know for sure, and everything that you mentioned now is declassified information that is widely available. Okay. One of the things that shocked me from the manner that the official story was told, or like the planes hitting the Twin Towers. And I was in New York, by the way. I had traffic court on 9/11 in downtown Manhattan But as an Arab, I cannot help it by being late. So I was late to the extent that I was on the Verrazano Bridge from Staten Island to Brooklyn, and I saw the black smoke coming out of the towers right after the second hit. Now, or some people say no planes, but I have spoken with many people that they have seen planes flying into the towers. So, I mean, there's a lot of chatter about these issues. No planes, no, it's missiles, no, it's empty planes, not this and that. So I want us to talk about what is known for a fact,
Okay.
and so we can have a common ground with anybody who's trying to really understand this from a logical manner. So the national security program at George Washington University, National Security Archive at George Washington University, published this declassified documents that I think they received via a FOIA request. Talks about Operation Northwoods, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff, during the time of President Kennedy, devised a plan in order to rile up people to gain the support of the American population in order to invade Cuba. One of the items that they included as something to do is to fly an airliner, but empty, like a drone, and put soundtrack as if it's been attacked by the Cubans, and basically killing the fake victims within the plane. Could there be similarities here? What do we know as fact regarding the day of 9/11? And please take it away.
Well, let me say one thing. There were planes. The question is which planes, what planes? So I'm not debating that there were no, I'm not saying there are no planes. I'm not in that camp at all.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that I would question is the passenger list on those planes. The first passenger list put out by the Associated Press, and I have that right here with me. There were no Arab names on those passenger lists for any of the planes. And there was a curious note at the top saying that they obtained these names from the friends and families of the passengers. Now, that's a very strange note. Why wouldn't you just go to the airline and obtain the passenger manifest? But that's where I start questioning who was really on those planes, because there is not conclusive evidence placing those people named on those particular planes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not only no conclusive evidence, Enver, but in fact, there's none of the very simple, straightforward evidence that there should be if, in fact, those people had been on the planes. You mentioned the passenger lists. Every flight in the United States has an authenticated passenger list that is basically signed, sealed, and stamped as soon as the flight is boarded. And there've never been any such list for these 9/11 planes. All we've seen are inauthentic, alleged passenger lists that the airlines provided to the media, and there are different versions with different names on different lists. There's never been an authenticated passenger list. There also has never been the slightest bit of corroboration by the eyewitnesses at the airlines who would have ticketed and boarded these Arab hijackers. Not one witness to them being on the planes has ever been cited anywhere. Likewise, there is all kinds of security footage of boarding areas and other parts of airports. There was still in 9/11 or in 2001, and none of that, no authentic footage of actual hijackers boarding any of these planes has ever been put forward. They put forward some supposed footage of Mohammed Atta boarding in Portland, Maine, but that wasn't the flight. That wasn't even the flight that supposedly hit the towers. So, and then they put out some inauthentic footage, ostensibly showing the Dulles Airport hijackers, but that was clearly fake for a long list of reasons. And nobody has ever even tried to claim that it was genuine. So there's no genuine security footage. There are no actual passenger lists, and there are no ticket stubs. Every flight that's boarded gets the ticket stubs collected and held None of that has ever appeared anywhere. So as Elias Davidson writes in his book, America's Mind Hijacked on 9/11, the U.S. government was obliged under international law to provide all of this evidence showing that the people it blamed for this crime were even on the plane, and it didn't. And then alongside that, we have all sorts of evidence that there were no actual hijackings at all. No sign of the doors to the cockpits being breached. Not one of the 4 pilots squawked out the hijack code, which takes about 2 seconds and would always happen if there were a real hijacking, and on and on and on. So I think if there's one thing that we know for sure about September 11th, 2001, is that the people they claimed hijacked the planes were not on the planes and certainly did not hijack them.
When you say it was never, there were never Arabs, are you saying that the government sealed those lists and didn't release them, or some other reason?
We don't know why they've never been produced anywhere. They were not produced at the Masaud trial, where they should have been produced. It's a complete mystery. All we know is that the passenger lists in the media are different from each other, and never have the authentic passenger lists or any lists with Arab names on them ever been shown anywhere. So the only lists we've seen in public, the ones that were given by the airlines to the media, did not have any of those Arab names of the supposed 19 hijackers.
Well,
Go ahead.
in fact, FBI Director Mueller himself is quoted as having said, "The identity of the hijackers remain in doubt." That's a verbatim quote. And that's been published in British papers, in more than one paper.
And when did he say that?
Yeah, and pardon?
When did he say that?
I have it on the website.
I think that was in late September. It was a while after the story had, they put out the story that these were the 19 guys. They put out that story the very next day. And the story of how they supposedly got the evidence for that is completely ridiculous. They claim that Mohammed Atta, for reasons unknown, and his accomplices, did not fly directly from Boston into the North Tower. Instead, they claim Mohammed Atta and his accomplices they were driving north. Instead of going to Boston and taking the plane from Boston and flying it into the towers, instead they drove all the way to Portland, Maine, far north of Boston. And then very early in the morning, they had to catch a commuter flight that would touch down in Boston, and then they would have to change flights and get onto Flight 11 to try to hit the North Tower with less than an hour to make the change of flights. What a ridiculous plan if you were trying to hijack a plane and fly it into the Trade Center. And then they tell us that Atta, his suitcase, miraculously happened to not get transferred onto the doomed Flight 11. So that's why they say it was discovered as evidence. And all of the evidence implicating these guys came out of that magic suitcase, where there were the most laughably fake documents, including a supposed hijacker's last will and testament that began with a botched version of the Bismillah. Instead of Bismillah Rahman Rahim, the English translation that the FBI gave us of this was in the name of myself and my family. Wow. In the name of myself and my family? That's how a crazy radical Muslim suicide pilot is going to write a last will and testament. And why would he put his last will and testament into a suitcase that he thought was going on to Flight 11 and it would be blown up when the plane crashed? Yeah. The whole thing is absurd, and it gets even worse from there because the FBI originally couldn't decide whether Atta and his accomplices had flown from Maine or from Boston. They claimed they found their car at both airports. And so they originally claimed, and then they got different names. The first names that the FBI gave us were completely different names from the next ones that they settled on. And the first names, these people had died like a year or two earlier. So then they had to go back to these other names. So this story of how they got these 19 hijackers on September 12th and put out their names and then had to change them. And then finally, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, when the FBI director said, we'll probably never know the real identities of whoever these guys were. And that was the last word from the FBI.
And didn't the BBC publish something that about 8 of them are still alive and well, and something like that later on in the month as well?
Yes.
That's true. I've gotten different names at different times. It's confusing who's alive and who's dead. But several alleged hijackers that come forward says we're alive.
And I actually remember Muhammad Atta's father saying on TV, I watched it, that Muhammad Atta spoke to him by phone after the time that the crash was supposed to have happened. So that didn't make any sense. The father was visibly confused and shaken, of course, but visibly confused. I don't understand. Like, he called me after that time that he was supposed to have crashed. But anyway, didn't they also claim that they found a passport after the crash, something like that, in the vicinity of the Twin Towers?
That's all that was left of either of these two airplanes, they said, aside from a little piece of engine or landing gear, was a hijacker's passport that was miraculously discovered by an unknown Good Samaritan and handed to the police.
And just imagine the amount of debris, the confusion, the ash, people fleeing, and somebody picks up a passport of all things and gets it to the authorities.
And the black boxes didn't survive that, but the passport did?
That's the official story, although there are witnesses who claim that they were present when black boxes were found in the rubble of the towers, and we don't know if that's true for sure. But the official story is that no, the black boxes did not survive.
I remember a couple of years before when Egypt Air Flight 990 crashed, after taking off from JFK heading to Cairo, it crashed off the coast of Long Island by Nantucket. And I remember Jim Hall, who was the NTSB chair at the time, they found the black box deep in the ocean after 2 or 3 days. I don't remember exactly the amount of time. And I remember him he was very arrogant the way he was speaking. And he said, due to the quality of the black box, we are sure that we're going to get to the bottom of this issue. I'm paraphrasing. Like, a black box that was like fell into the water for 3 days and survived, and you found it, and you say due to the quality of the black box. And what about those ones? What are these black boxes made of? Is it something that could withstand fire or something like that?
I don't know the exact materials, but they've been found in all kinds of crash sites. And to claim that one crash on land, that they cannot find the black box, or even a damaged black box, that is ridiculous.
Okay, but we know that we are told that one of the passports was found after the crash. It was on the flight that crashed into the Twin Towers, and it was found after that, confirming the identity of one of the supposed hijackers. Okay, I mean, viewers, of course, depending on your inclination, you could do more research on your own. There is a lot of material online. There is a lot of nonsense about this topic of 9/11. Like, the internet is filled with crazy theories. I'm not going to say conspiracy theory. I mean, yeah, they are. But as Enver Masaud said in the beginning, is there evidence to support the claim of conspiracy? So it's up to you. I think we killed the topic of the passengers. Let's move on to the issue of whether the crash caused the buildings to collapse or not. What are the facts that we know today?
Well, go ahead.
If you take the Twin Towers, we have engineers and architects who have looked at this, and even if you assume one thing, let's say the plane was able to destroy the tower, but it would only bring down that part of the tower above the point of crash. Mm-hmm. There's no reason whatsoever why all the structure below the point of crash would disintegrate. But we can go further. There wasn't enough force to even bring down the top half, because those designs were tested for a Boeing 707 going much faster and striking the tower, and it was able to withstand that because the tower has a very strong central core, and the outside of the tower is basically like a mosquito netting, and you can go through that. As long as the central core is largely intact, the tower will not come down.
So two things here. The
And fire was never hot enough to bring it down or widespread enough. It was basically diesel jet fuel, which is
Kerosene.
and you can put a steel stove, a steel kettle on a kerosene stove, leave it there all day. It's not going to melt. So the fire would have to have been large enough, widespread enough, and it still wouldn't have brought it down. And assuming it could, which is an assumption not even worth making, the collapse would not be symmetrical.
Right.
We saw it collapsing symmetrically. That is impossible under any circumstance.
And I remember in this case, the Deutsche Bank building that was damaged during 9/11, it didn't fall, but many years after, like 2000, I forgot, after 2007 or something like that, it had an 11 alarm fire and it didn't collapse.
Speaking of that Deutsche Bank building, the human bone fragments, tiny shards of human bone fragments were found all over the top of that building I forget if it was in 2009 or 10, I believe it was. And one has to ask oneself, how could a gravity-driven collapse of the towers somehow explode a human body into such tiny pieces that the bones were fragmented into slivers and blow those bones all over the top of neighboring buildings, which is what happened. And that leads to the observation that of the nearly 3,000 people who were said to have perished that day in the towers, and presumably who did, I'm not questioning that, more than 1,000 have never been identified by even a fingernail or the tiniest bone fragment, despite the most meticulous sifting and bucketing efforts as they went through every little bit of that rubble looking for pieces of victims. More than 1,000 people were vaporized, apparently, or disappeared into a black hole. Not the slightest bit of them remained for DNA testing. How could more than 1,000 people completely disappear from the face of the earth without leaving so much as a 1 milligram bone fragment? It's quite a mystery. And one of the ways that we know what happened probably was by all of those tiny bone fragments found all over the top of the Deutsche Bank building. This was reported in mainstream media, including the New York Times. And that leads us to look at the actual demolitions. Look at the buildings coming down. They're not falling. They're exploding. They're obviously exploding. Google the video North Tower Exploding, which is made by the scientist David Chandler, and watch these buildings being literally blown to kingdom come. Nobody with eyes can look at these things and see buildings falling down because their structures have weakened. What you're seeing is buildings being blown up with enormous explosive force. The only question is what kind of explosives could provide that force, because the towers were obviously blown up with a lot more explosive power than would normally be used in a normal controlled demolition.
So is there a theory about the bone fragments? What would have caused that?
No, the mainstream simply calls it a mystery. But the truth is obvious. Just look at the buildings being blown up. The entire buildings are being blasted to smithereens, and the smithereens include the people that were in them. And the smithereens are blasting upwards and outwards, and they're landing all around, including on the tops of neighboring buildings.
I'm not familiar with explosives and these things. So what could do something like this? What type of explosives could shred people in that manner?
Well, firefighters and news media on the scene report several explosions.
Right.
On the first day, they were reporting truthfully before the propaganda got to them.
Right.
But there are numerous reports of firefighters from media reporting explosions in those towers.
Right.
The most interesting one is from William Rodriguez. He had one of the 3 keys to the towers. He headed up the maintenance service, the janitorial service.
Right.
And he was in the basement talking to his folks when he heard an explosion below him. He thought the generators below him had blown up, and then a few seconds later, he heard an explosion at the top. But before whatever struck the towers, there was an explosion below him in the sub-basement.
So one of the survivors of 9/11 is a friend of mine. I have many friends. I live in New York for over 20 years. So one of them, when I spoke about William Rodriguez and I saw the video that you're talking about, he said he's a charlatan who just want to be famous and make some money. Of course, there was no basis for such a statement, but could, because of how explosives work, I'll give you the example of the latest explosion in Lebanon in the port. You saw the impact, you saw it first, the cloud, and then seconds after, you felt the impact and you heard the sound. So could this be something like that, or it wasn't studied?
No, Rodriguez is not a charlatan. You know, he was honored at the White House for being the last person out of the towers and rescuing somebody. There are pictures of him with George Bush and Hillary Clinton. Sorry, but anyway, he was honored. I've got pictures of him with President, Vice President, or Secretary of State. And they don't just honor somebody who's a charlatan. He must have been carefully vetted before he was honored.
Right.
So
he clearly was the last man out of the tower before it collapsed. And that was the basis of his story. And he didn't go public with his testimony about the fact that there were massive explosions in the sub-basements of the towers that also wrecked much of the lobby that happened before the plane crash, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 seconds or so, between 6 and 12 seconds, I think, before the plane crash. And that testimony has been corroborated by numerous people, including those who were horrifically injured in those explosions. People were killed in those explosions. Bobby McIntyre was killed in the lobby by this massive explosion that happened before the plane crashed, as his father has been screaming from the rooftops ever since it happened, practically. So Rodriguez is telling the truth about these explosions, and we have lots of, many injuries, and the people who were injured by these explosions have testified to them, and it's been determined that other people were killed by those explosions. So we can be absolutely 100% certain that huge explosions destroyed much of the sub-basements and badly damaged the lobby and killed and injured people in those locations before the planes hit.
So if those explosions, like as William and others mentioned, this is what weakened the foundation and made the collapse more possible when you added the flight crash on top.
No,
presumably. What do you think, Ender?
Yeah, it was explosives that brought it down, but it wouldn't have been just just the basement. There were explosives apparently wired into the building at various levels.
Right, and I remember watching the video as if it's a demolition, like floor after floor seems to be shooting out, which is very similar to controlled demolition.
Yeah.
There's just a new study just came out by Graham McQueen, who's a professor from Canada, and he shows that of all of the mainstream media reports that went out on September 11th, more than 3/4, I think it was, the vast majority described what happened to the towers as explosions destroyed them.
Mm-hmm.
So these, so far, we were speaking about the hard things to make logic of. I think the Pentagon and Shankville are much easier to debunk the official story. So why not take a few minutes to kill those out of the park first?
Well, at the Pentagon, which I was living right next to, short walk away, we have videos of Jamie McIntyre. I believe he was a CNN correspondent at the Pentagon.
Right.
And he's out there right after the event talking to Judy Woodruff, I believe, who is now the NPR host. And he's saying there's nothing here larger than what you can pick up in your hand.
Right.
And we have the Arlington County Fire Chief, who headed up the firefighting operation from the station right across from my condo, and he reluctant to answer questions about 9/11 at the press conference the next day. And one of the reporters asked him, could they do something about the reporters being handcuffed and dragged away?
Say that again?
The reporters were being handcuffed and dragged away. I have that transcript from September 12th, Pentagon transcript.
You mean reporters who went to the Pentagon after the crash, supposed crash?
World's press there was there, assembled for a press conference the next day.
Uh-huh.
Victoria Clark, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Communications, was there. The Arlington County Fire Chief was there, and I believe those are the two main speakers. And there's no mention of the flight in that transcript. There's no mention of Dulles Airport, from where the plane is supposed to have flown. And and the principals say we don't want to talk about it.
Okay.
And then we have another Arlington County police guy who's in charge of the night shift or something. He comes on and it says the same thing. There's nothing here that looks like a plane. So we have all these videos. They're in evidence.
And I remember Jamie McIntyre, the CNN correspondent, saying, I don't see anything that says, I'm paraphrasing, that there was a plane here. So yeah, and Dr. Barrett, what do you think about this issue?
Well, it's a very tricky issue. I actually think that the controlled demolitions in New York are much easier to demonstrate and prove, especially Building 7, which we haven't even mentioned yet, right? But we can maybe get back to Building 7 in a bit. But I think anybody who's new to this issue should first take a look at what happened to Building 7 at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, which the government still says is a fire-driven collapse. That's obvious. Anybody can see the truth about Building 7 in New York. However, the Pentagon case, I don't think it's quite as obvious in terms of the forensics of what happened at the building, although Enver is an expert and I will defer to his opinion there. But what's obvious to me about the official story of the Pentagon is that it's ridiculous for other reasons. First, they say that Hani Hanjour, the 9/11 Commission says that he was the best of the hijacker pilots. And yet, he was so bad that he was not allowed to solo in a Cessna training aircraft. And yet, according to the 9/11 Commission, Hani Hanjour took over the controls of a Boeing 757, and he'd never flown a big plane before. He couldn't even fly the simplest little plane. And he supposedly turned it around over Ohio and flew it many hundreds of miles and flew a beeline to Washington, D.C. And when he got to Washington, D.C., according to the official story, he put that plane into a corkscrew dive that the world's greatest pilots could not have done. It probably pulled more G's than would have allowed anyone to remain conscious on that plane. And this tight corkscrew dive dropped the plane nearly 10,000 feet in little over 2 minutes. And that allowed this plane to come skimming in from the far side of the Pentagon and clip the lawn, but not leave a scratch on the lawn, in order to hit only the bottom part of the Pentagon. Now, this feat of flying would have defied the world's best pilots, and many pilots say it's aerodynamically impossible, and yet we're told that somebody who couldn't fly a Cessna training aircraft did it. That is ridiculous. And there are other aspects of this case that are equally ridiculous. That is the claim that hijackers were on the plane. Where did that come from? It came from reports of an alleged cell phone call made by the caller was supposedly the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson, the Bush crime family's #1 lawyer, the man who had twisted the arms of the Supreme Court to put Bush in office after he lost the election to Al Gore. His wife, Barbara Olson, we're told by the 9/11 Commission, called from a cell phone, and then the story has flipped back and forth. Ted Olson has called it a cell phone, and other times he said it was a seatback phone. And she supposedly spent minutes on the phone with Ted Olson as this plane was zooming into the Pentagon. Now the FBI then later said that whole story, which was enshrined in the 9/11 Commission report, is a lie. It never happened. According to the FBI, there was an attempt from Barbara Olson's cell phone to call Ted Olson, during that period, and it lasted for 0 seconds. So Ted Olson is described speaking for minutes and minutes with his wife on the doomed flight. He was either lying or maybe somebody spoofed him with a call that wasn't really from his wife. In any case, that story, which is the story that created the whole legend of cell phone calls, which were technologically impossible from these hijacked airliners, that story is now certified to be a lie by the FBI.
And is this information, you said the FBI issued a report or something, correction?
This came out in the FBI evidence that was entered into evidence at the Masaud trial many years after September 11th. And that evidence completely changed the official story and drastically contradicted the 9/11 Commission report, not least of all by, as I said, revealing that Solicitor General Ted Olson lied to the nation when he repeatedly went on television and claimed that his wife had called him from a doomed aircraft.
Or, as you mentioned, somebody might have spoofed him. I got spoofed calls. We were living in fear. Maybe this story might help someone. In the middle of the night, 2, 3 a.m., I received a phone call from my mother-in-law's number, my father-in-law and mother-in-law. So I immediately pick up, frantic, maybe something happened to one of them. And I said, hello, no answer. So I call right back, only to wake them up. And I ask her, did you just call us? No. Where's your husband, my father-in-law? He's sleeping next to me. While speaking to her on the phone, I get a call, and I look at the caller ID, and it's their number while on the call with them. So these things could happen. So maybe somebody spoofed, and this technology is available.
Well, but what are the odds that the whole story of the cell phone calls from the doomed aircraft would be put into circulation by a very dubious, mobbed-up lawyer, the man who had argued Bush into the White House even after Bush lost the election? I mean, what are the odds that his wife would supposedly make this phone call and he would describe it, and then it would turn out to be false?
Right.
You know.
That story was on the front page of the Washington Post the very next day. So we know it was planted there, and it was a lie. By the way, on the Pentagon, I find that very easy to debunk. I noticed that in the initial, for many years, much of the 9/11 Truth movement focused on the towers. I focus on the Pentagon because I have a pilot's license also, and I live right by it. And there's a lot more evidence. We have evidence in the transcripts from the team of engineers at the Pentagon that was charged with drawing up the plans for rebuilding the Pentagon. They are questioning what happened. They say, if it came in the way you said it did, how come the wings are not outside? And we know there were no wings outside. Right. There's a whole bunch of, a lot of issues. We have a witness whose office was right there within a few feet of where the alleged plane entered. Trying to remember her name. Perhaps Dr. Barrett might remember. But we've got her sworn testimony.
April Gallup.
April Gallup. I've spoken to her on the phone. She lives in Richmond, Virginia. That there were no plane. We also have testimony that there was an explosion shortly before the alleged event, and that all the clocks stopped. And one further thing, there was a hearing going on in Congress asking for the whereabouts of about 2.3 or 3.2 trillion dollars. Is it billion or trillion?
Yeah, 2.3 trillion.
Trillion missing from the defense budget. That hearing was going on the day before. And we were told that the records for those that budget were in the area destroyed by the plane. So it's just so unlikely, not just unlikely, impossible events.
Right, and these 2.3 trillion missing dollars were announced by none other than Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time.
And that's 7 times the then military budget. 7 times the annual military budget disappeared, and Rumsfeld announced that it was missing on the night of September 10th, 2001.
Right, and therefore the plane hit the area of the Pentagon where the investigation was taking place, and they lost all the papers in the supposed attack.
There's so much more. We have lots of photos and videos of the events of those days. There's no evidence of that plane, although some claim they see it. There's I'm forgetting. I'm 81 years old. Remember, I'm forgetting some. There's lots. Go ahead. Why don't you? It'll come back to me. Go ahead.
Sure. So I remember that we heard that the FBI confiscated the videotapes from the surrounding gas stations and stuff like that. Has those ever been publicized or investigated or anything like that?
No, in fact, that gas station is there no more. It's been
well. I think a couple of videos have been released, and they've raised more questions than they've answered. Let's put it that way.
We have videos of a police car going by and an explosion, but they don't tell you any more than what we already knew.
Right. Okay, so that's the Pentagon. Before we go to Shanksville, I cannot believe that I forgot about Building 7. So let's take a few minutes to talk about it. And Dr. Barrett, go ahead. Right.
I think this is the place to start. If you're new to this subject, look at the issue of what happened to Building 7 at 5:23 in the afternoon on September 11th. And this was long after the towers had come down. The towers came down that morning at like just before 10 o'clock and then a little after 10:30 or a little before 10:30 in the morning. And then at 5:23, I think, in the afternoon, Building 7, which was a World Trade Center complex building, but it was quite a long way from the towers and had seemingly suffered only very minor damage from the explosive demolition of the towers. And it had some smoke pouring from it, but it didn't even look like fires. It looked like somebody had set off smoke bomb or smoke charges in there to make it look like there were fires. Building 7 then came down straight into its footprint at exactly free fall acceleration for the first 2.5, nearly 3 seconds, and then very close to free fall acceleration the rest of the way. That means that this building, this 47-story building, just disappeared like a train going straight down into the earth in 6.5 seconds. And that's about the time that it would take to drop a bowling ball off the roof. If you'd stood on the top of Building 7, dropped a bowling ball off the roof at the time it started coming down, the building would come down almost as fast as the bowling ball fell through thin air. What that means is that all of the vertical supports, these thick, powerful steel beams that held the building up, had to have all been taken out. They had to have basically disappeared all at once. And if one had disappeared even a split second before the other one, it would have toppled sideways. These tall buildings are like trees. What does it take to take a tree down straight onto its stump and turn it into a pile of sawdust? Well, that's very, very hard to do. And likewise, it's really hard to make a building come straight down symmetrically into its footprint, which is why controlled demolition companies are paid huge amounts of money to do it. Otherwise, buildings will topple and destroy buildings to the side. So Building 7 came straight down at free fall or close to free fall acceleration. It was absolute free fall for more than 2.5 seconds, as David Chandler has proved, and NIST has basically admitted they lied when they initially said that wasn't true. So look at that, and then look at the tapes of witnesses talking about what happened right before this building was blown up. There are witnesses who were there who listened to the countdown to demolition going out over police radio. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and boom, explosions, and the building comes straight down, just like those hotels you've seen being destroyed in Las Vegas. And then look into the background of Building 7. It turns out that a very dubious, allegedly organized crime-connected individual, a certain Mr. Larry Silverstein, had purchased the entire World Trade Center complex 6 weeks before 9/11 and doubled the insurance, doubled the terrorism insurance. And then on 9/11 itself, he miraculously didn't go to breakfast at the top of the North Tower as he always did, claiming later that his wife had reminded him of a dermatologist appointment. This mobbed up individual, Mr. Larry Silverstein, who had been involved in human trafficking and prostitution charges and investigations in the past as he built up his empire, he then ended up confessing on a public television program called America Rebuilds that he had been part of the decision to pull, that is, demolish Building 7. He said, I was talking to the fire department commander, and we said, there's been so much loss of life. Maybe the best thing to do is pull it. And so we made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. That's exactly what he says on that documentary, admitting that he was party to the controlled demolition of Building 7. And yet, since that day, the official story is that Building 7 fell down from the equivalent of wastebasket fires that were somehow started by little bits and pieces of the blown-up Twin Towers. And Larry Silverstein collected $750 million in insurance money from the destruction of that building, Building 7, that he is on record on national public television stating that he helped demolish. So look at that first and foremost. And once you've looked into Building 7 and Larry Silverstein's obvious insurance fraud, after that, you will see that 9/11 is not what they're telling you.
And didn't he also collect on the Twin Towers as two separate incidents?
Yes. He doubled the insurance when he bought the Trade Center. He wasn't even the low bid, but because he was mobbed up, he got the contract to buy the whole World Trade Center 6 weeks before 9/11. And then he doubled the insurance. And then after 9/11 happened and saved him, because he would have lost all his money otherwise, because the Twin Towers were the worst white elephant in the history of architecture. They were riddled with asbestos. There was a court order to tear down the asbestos, which would have cost far more than the buildings were worth. They had antiquated infrastructure. They had a problem with the steel and aluminum cladding causing rusting through electrolysis. Those buildings were doomed. And the city had been desperate to find a way to take those buildings down for years. And then 6 weeks before 9/11, mobbed up Larry Silverstein buys the buildings on a non-low bid contract, doubles the insurance, and then after September 11th, he doubles his money yet again by claiming that he has been victimized by two completely separate terrorist attacks, namely the two airplanes. So, you just can't make this stuff up. And it's at some point, Larry Silverstein becomes sort of the poster child for the absolute criminality of the wealthy elite that runs this country.
And he collected about $3.5 billion, right, for the Twin Towers?
It was $4.5 billion. he put 15 million of his own money into this purchase, and another 100 million of other people's money that he rounded up. And so he only put 15 million of his own in, and he walked off with $4.5 billion plus rights to rebuild. So he hit the jackpot on 9/11.
But of course, I doubt that him alone could benefit from 9/11 or behind 9/11 or anything like that.
He has interesting associations. He gets on the phone every week with Benjamin Netanyahu, according to Haaretz newspaper in Israel.
Right. One second, Mr. Masaud. Building 7 also was hosting the headquarters of the CIA in downtown Manhattan, the FTC and stuff like that, or?
Yeah, and it was supposed to have been storing gold also. But there's one more interesting point about Building 7.
Mm-hmm.
It was not even mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report.
Yes.
They omitted it altogether.
Mm.
And the media sort of forgot about it also, till there was pressure put on it from the 9/11 Truth Movement.
Right.
And even now, you don't see much about Building 7.
Right. And wasn't there a study recently by the University of Alaska talking about either Building 7 or the complex, the World Trade Center complex?
Yeah, that was led by Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska. And they did a very elaborate computer model of the destruction of Building 7, showing that the only way it could have come down that way is having all of the steel structural vertical supports removed at the same time, meaning controlled demolition. And so far, that they haven't managed to get NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to basically go back and admit that their ridiculous model is wrong.
Right. Okay. So is this sufficient for us to move to Shankville? I think we killed it so far. We've been speaking for an hour and 5 minutes about the World Trade Center buildings, the 3 buildings that were demolished on 9/11, and the attack or the explosion in the Pentagon. What about Shankville?
Shanksville, we have a video from a reporter that's circling over the area where the plane allegedly went into the ground. And she's saying there's nothing here but a hole in the ground. And there's nothing bigger than a telephone book that you can pick up. So this is a reporter. We have the video. You can see the hole. There's no plane there. We have another video of the rescue and firefighting squad that's out there. He describes the dimensions of the hole. There's nothing there about a plane. And the story gets more interesting. It emerges that the plane, whatever was there, was shot down, and the debris is scattered all over the air for a few miles. And I believe Cheney's in there, and in the story saying where they gave the order to shoot it down. Perhaps Kevin can add to that.
Yes, this is one of the best documented issues that any reasonable person who looks into this will quickly understand that there's a massive cover-up of something huge regarding 9/11 by looking at the information about the cover-up of Dick Cheney's whereabouts and to some extent Donald Rumsfeld's whereabouts and Richard Myers, head of the Joint Chiefs, whereabouts during all of this activity on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And the first and most obvious problem is the way that Dick Cheney repeatedly lied and then was lied for to cover up what he was really doing that morning. He gave different and completely conflicting stories about what happened and what he did and where he was that morning. It's never really been cleared up which of those stories is true, but the fact that he was lying and that likewise so was Rumsfeld and Richard Myers is extremely concerning. And it looks like part of the reason that they lied to cover up what Cheney was really doing is that, as Enver mentioned, it looks like he was giving an order to shoot down Flight 93. For the details on this, I recommend that people go to the Consensus 9/11 Consensus Panel's website, which is consensus911.org, and look at their findings regarding the cover-ups of the whereabouts of these key people, including Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Myers on 9/11.
So I remember on 9/11 listening to the radio. I was in the car, as I mentioned earlier, and about 10 o'clock, right before the Twin Towers starting, the second tower fell, I remember hearing reporting that a car bomb exploded outside of the State Department in Washington, D.C., and many other reports that turned out to be false later on in the day and the days after. I felt like when I looked into this, when I researched it for many, many, many months, that there might have been an attempt to really shock the population in order to, pass something. And I guess I want to maybe use the second hour in talking about, now that we spoke about the actual events of 9/11, who benefits, why, and what happened since then, and if we can connect the dots and connect the people to these issues. So, first of all, does it have to be an inside job? What is the definition of an inside job? What is the definition of a false flag operation? So we can start from a common ground so people understand what we're talking about.
Well, an inside job is like a bank robbery where somebody who works in the bank helps the robbers. And in that sense, obviously, September 11th, 2001 was an inside job because people at the highest levels of the U.S. government were obviously complicit in some way in what happened. And then a false flag is an attack which is designed to be attributed to someone else, usually an enemy. And it goes back to naval warfare when, like, Spain might want to make it look like France attacked England. So Spain would fly the French flag and attack an English ship. So if you mount an attack and blame it on somebody that didn't really do it, that's a false flag. Like
the Gulf of Tonkin, for example?
Well, that never really even happened. So
never even happened.
Yeah, they just said that the North Vietnamese attacked us, but nobody really did.
Right. So could 9/11 be happened by an outside the government, forces outside the government, domestic or foreign, or a combination of both? But the government found itself in a position that they cannot really tell the truth, and so it doesn't really have to be an inside job per se, but they were forced to a certain position.
Well, there are things we do, and there are things that we can hypothesize.
Right.
I'm willing to say that whoever benefited should be looked into, and I've written a paper in which I name about a dozen or more individuals who I say should be questioned because they either had a role in something or they covered up something. And at the top of the list is Cheney, there's Rumsfeld, there's Olson, there are various others. So it was an inside job, as Kevin says, but we don't really know who played what part in great detail. But being an engineer and one who has to put his name to reports and what I used to do for a living, I would wait to identify persons. I know there are others who have gone ahead and named people. I have only named them as persons of interest to be further questioned.
Right. So I've heard radio shows with a former military guy. He was a professor at West Point. I forgot her name, Alan Sabrowski or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And he's talking, or his thesis, that Israel did 9/11.
Right.
Any basis to support his claim?
They are among the people that would benefit. What you got to ask yourself, who had the motive, means, and opportunity? Right. Well, within the U.S., there's motive that we wanted to control the resource of Middle East, Central Asia. We have the means, we have the opportunity. Russia had the means and opportunity, but they didn't have that same motive. Right? Israel is the only other country that had motive, means, and opportunity.
Why Russia doesn't?
What do they benefit by us attacking that part of the world?
And how could they get away with it and have it covered up?
Yeah, and the Western world would have exposed them long ago.
Right.
Israel has such a powerful presence in U.S. political system, the media, and the financial sector that it's easy to imagine how neoconservatives, who were basically very, very radical, Likudnik Israeli partisans, once they got into power with the Bush administration, and they were already signed up with this plan to remake the Middle East for Israel. That was the clean break document that these guys wrote in 1996, I think it was. And then the same guys went and wrote the PNAC memo, Rebuilding America's Defenses, published in September 2000, 1 year before 9/11, which called for a new Pearl Harbor to draw the U.S. into these wars in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. So when General Clark, Wesley Clark, says that after 9/11, he was approached by one of these pro-Israel rabid neocons and informed that what this was really about was taking out 7 countries in 5 years. Those 7 countries, it turns out, are the ones that Israel was worried about for the most part, including Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. And Somalia and Sudan may have been peripheral to this, but the rest of those countries were, and even to some extent Sudan, were serious problems for Israel. And since then, these U.S. invasions have put U.S. military bases surrounding the biggest problem for Israel, which is Iran. As we all see in the news today, Iran is relentlessly demonized in the American media for a number of reasons, but the main reason is that Iran stands with the people of the region against the endless Zionist, supremacist, expansionist state of Israel, and stands with the Palestinians and supports the Palestinians. And of course, before 9/11, Colonel Gaddafi did. He was providing all kinds of help to the Palestinian resistance. Saddam Hussein was providing help to the Palestinian resistance. And all of that's been wiped out. And then Israel used 9/11 as an excuse to squash the Palestinians. Additionally, Israel used 9/11 to save it from bankruptcy. Israel was going bankrupt during the year or two before 9/11 because the dot-com bust had wrecked their economy, and then the suicide bombs were causing tourists to stay away and causing Jews to flee Israel faster than they were coming to Israel. So Israel was in a terrible state before 9/11, and as Naomi Klein writes in The Shock Doctrine, Israel put all of its chips, it took all of its money out of almost all other government programs in early 2001 and put them into anti-terror and surveillance startups, incubators in the private sector, kind of public-private hybrids. And they took over the world because post 9/11, the entire world has gone into all of that stuff in a big way. And now Israel has the lead in all of the surveillance technology, the anti-terror technology. And so they were saved from bankruptcy and became extremely powerful and prosperous thanks to these attacks, which hijacked the U.S. military to destroy Israel's enemies. So you add all that together, the only geopolitical winner has been Israel. The U.S. has been utterly destroyed. The U.S. has squandered $7 trillion on wars that do not help the U.S. at all in terms of its geostrategy. They actually hurt the U.S. Meanwhile, China has rose to the point that it has essentially already supplanted the U.S. as the #1 power, laughing all the way to the bank as the U.S. spends 20 years putting all of its blood and treasure into a useless war against the Arabs and Muslims who should have been America's best friends and would be America's best friends in the struggle against America's real rivals, Russia, India, China, and so on, except for 9/11, which hijacked the U.S. for Israel. So given that, Christopher Bolin's book, Solving 9/11, makes a very good case that Israel is the prime force behind 9/11. And frankly, I think that's probably the case.
Yeah. If I were a gambling person, that's where I'd lay my money.
So could Israel have done this by itself?
No. They had to have had cooperation of folks inside the U.S.
Okay.
Military, private contractors, ex-special forces.
And they had a hold on the president and vice president. And who knows what kind of Jeffrey Epstein type material they had on those people. The rumors about George W. Bush are that he has been thoroughly filmed and photographed in a child bordello in the Caribbean, Jeffrey Epstein style. And Cheney was said to be the reason that the D.C. madam, Deborah Jean Palfrey, was suicided by hanging just as she was about to spill the beans. So Israel controls people in a lot of different ways, and one of them is Jeffrey Epstein-style sexual blackmail. Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli intelligence agent, according to Viktor Ostrovsky, the former Mossad officer. So, you know, Israel has a lot of power in the United States in the financial sector that dominates the journalism world. And people who don't know this should read Philip Weiss's article, Do We Jews Dominate Media? And So What If We Do? Israel is the only nation in the world that has the power to essentially turn the top American leadership to do something like this that's counterproductive and against American interests, but that perfectly serves Israeli interests.
I don't know where to go from here. So there is definitely motive, means, and what else did you mention?
Opportunity.
And opportunity. Any other potential benefactors?
Well, there's one other interesting fact. You know, when the 9/11 Commission was set up, they had a large staff, and the head of that staff was Peter Zelikow?
Philip.
Philip Zelikow, yeah. Now, Zelikow, if you look up his resume and bio, his specialty is the creation of myth. So he was hired in the Bush administration to head up that staff, and then later Obama hired him also.
What does that mean, creation of myth?
Make a myth.
He's a history professor, and he says that what matters about history is not what really happened, but the myth that people believe, whether or not it's true.
Every country dresses up their history to make themselves look better, and consciously or unconsciously. But he was hired because that's his specialty. He controlled access to the commissioners. He and another professor wrote the 9/11 Commission report.
Right.
The person we mentioned at the World Trade Center, William Rodriguez, he testified before them, but his testimony was omitted from the 9/11 Commission report.
So Philip Zelikow is the author with someone else of the final 9/11 Commission report.
And the commissioners themselves, in their book, which they wrote afterwards, they write, "We were set up to fail."
Right.
And one of the commissioners, the senator from, I believe, Georgia, the paraplegic, he resigned from the commission, saying this is a what?
He said it was a whitewash. That you're talking about Max Cleland. He said it was
Yeah.
the worst whitewash since the Warren Commission, and he resigned.
Yeah.
And you know, there have been other whistleblowers too, high-level people like Senator Mark Dayton of Minnesota, who, when the 9/11 Commission report came out, he grilled he gave a speech to the Senate saying the military has lied to us. The military gave us three completely different and contradictory stories about how it responded on 9/11. In terms of sending up fighter jets. This is a part we haven't talked about here yet. But anyway, he said, and the 9/11 commissioners actually said they considered charging top U.S. military leaders with perjury, and then for unknown reasons decided not to. So anyway, Mark Dayton got very upset about this and gave a speech railing about, he said, what's the use of even having a democratic government if the military can just lie to us like this? He almost broke down crying in the middle of his speech. And then a few days later, it was announced in the media that he had decided to take all of his staff and evacuate his office in Washington, D.C., and remove all of his staff, all of his papers, all of his work, and take it back to Minnesota and not run for re-election due to what he termed terrorist threats. So Mark Dayton later became governor of Minnesota, but at least he survived. Another Minnesota senator, Paul Wellstone, who also was skeptical of the official story of 9/11, was threatened by Dick Cheney in running into the election in 2002. And then a few days after, Cheney threatened that if you continue to obstruct us, there will be the most terrible or extreme consequences for yourself personally and for the state of Minnesota. And Wellstone didn't cower before Cheney. And then a few days later, Wellstone's plane went down with his wife, daughter, and his entire campaign staff in circumstances that were initially described in media reports as bad weather. It turned out the weather was fine, and that plane was taken down by some kind of directed energy beam that fried the electronics on the plane. So Senator Wellstone was murdered. Barbara Boxer, the senator of California, said that the murder of Senator Wellstone was, quote, a message to us all. And she actually said to me on Wisconsin Public Radio when I called in and talked to her, this is Barbara Boxer, leading senator in the United States, that she knew that the official 9/11 Commission report was not true. But she said that our top priority now is to end the war in Iraq, was her way of avoiding dealing with it. So these kinds of murders, and we've seen others too. Senator Dennis Kucinich, or rather Representative Kucinich, was going to look into the put options. That is, people who knew 9/11 was going to happen bought these so-called put options on stocks in American Airlines, United Airlines, Morgan Stanley, that was in the Trade Center, and a couple other companies in the Trade Center. So they made a fortune when those stocks took a nosedive after 9/11. And the 9/11 Commission report said, well, we looked into this and we discovered that it wasn't Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that bought those put options, so don't worry about it. And Kucinich, of course, was outraged by that and many other things. And so he announced that he was going to form a committee and look into the put options. And then I forget if it was his sister and three of his relatives all dropped dead in a very short space of time. And then he stopped taking calls from the 9/11 Truth Movement, and he dropped his plans to investigate the put options. And Kurt Weldon, another representative, was looking into the foreknowledge where top authorities ordered him. He was part of a military program called Able Danger that was surveilling the 19 hijackers during the year before 9/11. He was all over them. And his superiors came to him and stole all his data, all of his computer disks, and destroyed them, and forced him to put little yellow sticky pads over the faces of Mohammed Atta and some of these other alleged hijackers and pretend that he never knew who they were. And all of this before 9/11. And then Kurt Weldon, who tried to blow the whistle on this, got attacked and charged with false criminal charges and stuff, and forced out of the House of Representatives. So a lot of politicians, Cynthia McKinney tried to take this up, and she grilled Rumsfeld about the war games. 9/11 was launched under cover of war games. September 11, 2001 was the biggest national security special event day pre-announced in all American history, with 46 military drills related to that day, 25 plus of which happened on that day. And those drills were the cover for actually pulling off 9/11. So Cynthia McKinney basically said that and charged Rumsfeld with being part of it. And she then was forced out of the House of Representatives. So insiders have pushed back to some extent. People in the military have pushed back. Colonel Bob Bowman became a leader of the 9/11 Truth Movement, and so on and so on. But unfortunately, the ruthless folks who did 9/11 and those who want to cover it up are simply more powerful than the handful of brave people who've tried to blow the whistle.
Is this something similar to what we saw in the movie Enemy of the State? Will Smith and Gene Hackman, when the NSA was like killed a senator, and
Yeah, I've seen it, but I don't remember.
right, and they defamed the guy who happened by chance to have the tape of the killing and something like that. So like there's underhanded work to coerce people to take certain positions or say certain things. Is that basically what's could be happening?
Of course. Criminal organizations, the mafia, and also intelligence agencies and military organizations, they all have things like hired killers to clean up situations. And let's face it, the intelligence world and the world of the military is rife with corruption. The CIA is a dominant player in the world drug trade. And for a long time, it was laundering much of the world's drug money through the Vatican Bank and through other of the world's biggest banks and corporations. Gary Webb won a Pulitzer Prize for this, and then he ended up as a 2-bullet to the head suicide. So this kind of corruption is endemic, and many Muslims here in the United States don't understand this. They think that their countries are corrupt. Like my wife is from Morocco. I've lived in Morocco, and sometimes people might bribe a policeman or something, and they think Morocco is corrupt, and they come to America and they initially may think that it's squeaky clean, and they believe what they read in the newspapers. But as more and more people know, thanks to Jeffrey Epstein revelations and things like that, that's just not true. At the top level, the United States is one of the most corrupt countries on earth, if not the most corrupt. With the drug trade, which supports the entire American capitalist infrastructure, being right at the top of that. So yeah, whenever there's a threat to put powerful people in prison, you can bet that people will be threatened, people will be blackmailed, people may be killed if necessary. That's just how the game is played.
Talk more about Gary Webb and also include Michael Rupert.
Yeah, Mike Rupert was one of the great inspirations to the 9/11 Truth Movement. In fact, his work was some of the earliest work I saw on this before I really even believed it. He was a Los Angeles police detective charged with looking into drug trafficking, and then he was dating a woman who was linked to the exiled Shah of Iran's royal family, and she was part of the CIA-linked drug smuggling operation, and she took him to New Orleans, where he actually watched this vast amount of heroin being offloaded in a drug smuggling operation protected by the CIA and their billionaire friends, like her family. And he broke up with her. He was disgusted by that. And from that point on, he became a whistleblower on these matters. And so when 9/11 happened, he did a big investigation and published a huge book about it. And he stressed the war games that I mentioned, the 46 drills that were scheduled to take place on and around 9/11. And he did a wonderful job exposing this. And he's, of all the people who've studied CIA drug dealing and things like that, and then moved on to 9/11, and this would include people like Daniel Hopsicker, who wrote a terrific book on the supposed hijackers, showing that they were the least, they were not even practicing Muslims, or at least the people who were impersonating these hijackers were not. They were drinking alcohol and snorting cocaine, dating pink-haired strippers, gambling on Jack Abramoff's casino boats, regularly flying to Las Vegas to gamble. All of this money was being provided by Santa Claus. They were pretending to learn to fly at CIA drug import airstrips. So Daniel Hopsicker wrote about this in his book, Welcome to Terrorland. Mike Rupert, who is also, he comes out of the same world, that is journalists investigating CIA drug dealing. He unfortunately was, he was very, very emotionally attached to his work. And when these criminals got away with 9/11, it really kind of crushed his spirit, and then he ended up a suicide. May Allah have mercy on his soul. But Mike Rupert was one of the great truth warriors of America, and he's missed.
And I remember watching his video on C-SPAN when he confronted John Deutsch, former CIA director, about the CIA trafficking drugs in LA when he was an LAPD detective. Did you watch that video as well?
Yes. And this relates to what's going on today with the Black Lives Matter protests and then the pushback. This, the establishment here in the United States, the white establishment, the rich white establishment, has systematically targeted the African American community in so many ways. Historically, the rich white establishment, and especially the mobbed up, criminal wing of that establishment, has used the African American community as a place to go for sex, for prostitutes and drugs and all kinds of evils. And that has hurt the moral fabric of the African American community. And one of the things they did was the CIA brought drugs, cocaine, and created the crack epidemic, and basically protected the crack dealers in Los Angeles and other American cities, and systematically destroyed whole neighborhoods, which then they and their friends would buy up all the property on the cheap, and then they would move the drugs to a different neighborhood, and they would make a ton of money on the real estate. So this is the kind of criminal activity that Mike Rupert investigated and exposed, that Gary Webb exposed. And often the result of this is you end up as a two-bullet to the head suicide like Gary Webb, or a more plausible suicide story as happened to Michael Rupert.
Yeah. What? We talked about opportunities earlier.
Right.
Right after 9/11, all the major Muslim organizations accepted the official account of 9/11. And that's understandable. Back then, we didn't know better. But almost 20 years later, it's time for us to speak up. Imagine with all the mosques we have, their membership, if all of them were speaking to their friends and neighbors and doing more to expose this, it would benefit not just Muslims, but America itself, because we are paying for all these wars.
Right.
And much of the world doesn't believe the story. It's only Americans who believe the story about 9/11. I was in India giving a talk in a town called Dehradun, which is in the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains. It happens to be where a lot of the Indian military people, Air Force people settle. And I gave a talk there at the Rotary Club, and the audience was largely military and their intelligence, Indian intelligence. And at the end of my talk, it was just a short talk, the guy for the senior intelligence guy stood up and said, "Well, you've cleared up a lot of points for us, and we believe you." That was his comment. Thinking people who take the time to check the material available, do not believe the official account.
Right.
It's time for we Muslims, the major organizations, got together or separately, but start speaking out.
So in what form do you see this happening? What would
I don't see it happening because I've tried many times to get them. Perhaps Kevin Barrett has more luck in Wisconsin, but I've tried to speak to, I know the leaders of the major Muslim organization personally. CARE, which is very big. I remember back at the time of the first Gulf War, CARE and I and my organization, the Wisdom Fund, TWF.org, we started up the same year. I was at demonstrating a small group with Ibrahim Cooper and CARE guy in JIHAD Awad outside, I think it was a Burger King in Arlington. So these guys, they're very big now. They have the branches and all where they can get a lot of phone calls going. They can build up a lot of pressure. If ISNA and the other Muslim organizations just start getting the story out on their own, they don't have to have a central plan, just on their own, get the story out. That would be good.
So I'm gonna play devil's advocate also on this issue. Like, although yes, I want not only Muslims, every person of conscience who look at the evidence and understand there is no way the official story holds water. And the brunt of the problem, like the revenge, for lack of a better term, came on Muslims domestically and overseas.
Yeah, and the middle and lower class in America, they didn't benefit. The military, the lower staff didn't benefit. They died. They got wounded. I understand about 20 veterans commit suicide every day. There are all those veterans screwed up with PTSD and broken limbs and other things. So they didn't benefit. It's only the few at the top benefited.
Well, the bankers benefited through riba. As Muslims, we and followers of Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, we are at war with the usurers. We're at war with the people of riba, or we're supposed to be anyway, if we're really Muslims. And that $7 trillion that's been spent on wars since 9/11 had to be borrowed at compound interest from banks. Banks have orchestrated all of the biggest wars because of this, because governments have to borrow huge amounts of money at compound interest. And the banks have really taken over this country with 9/11 and then with the 2008 bailout with QE, trillions and trillions of dollars just handed to these banks. They're given the right to make more and more money out of nothing and lend it into existence at interest. And now we're seeing an even bigger episode of that due to the coronavirus, which is another suspicious event that we could talk about someday. And I think Muslims in the United States need to recognize that we are living in a society run by the worst people of riba in all of human history. And if you're not at war with the leaders of our society, who are the people of riba, then I don't see how you can call yourself a Muslim.
Riba is usually in English as it's known even in the Bible, and it's basically interest on money that is loaned. So you mentioned that the banks kind of created this environment, and there is a video. It's basically a transcription or like an audio version of a writing. The title is "All Wars Are Bankers' Wars." It's available of course on YouTube, but also on Amazon Prime, and so it's widely available. I recommend it. It's about 45 minutes. Listen to the content. It might give an idea, but since you mentioned it, why don't you give a brief explanation of this issue?
Right. Well, in Islam, our traditional understanding is that any kind of lending at interest is haram. It's wrong. And those who continue to do it after it was banned are at war with God and his prophet. And yet it dominates the world today. And in fact, it's worse than that, because at the time of the prophet, peace upon him, the usurers were simply lending out their own money at interest. But today, the whole financial system consists of the system of money creation being private bankers issue the currency out of nothing by lending it into existence at interest. It's fiat currency. It doesn't represent gold or silver anymore. It's just paper or digits on a computer screen. And the private bankers have bribed the politicians since the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to gain the right to create the entire currency supply out of nothing by just simply creating it out of nothing and lending it into existence at interest, compound interest or riba. And then they get all of that money that they created back, plus the riba, which doesn't even exist mathematically. So now they have to create even more money so that there will be enough money supply to pay them the riba. And then that becomes compounded as well. Now, Enver, you're an engineer and you know very well how this kind of logarithmic progression or exponential increase works. You know, if you invest $1 2,000 years ago, by today at 5% interest, by today you would have more money than there are atoms in the galaxy. So it goes up and up in a steeper curve forever. So compound interest is a sure way for whoever is the lenders at riba to gain control of the entire money supply. And essentially they've done that. And these are really bad people. And I think ultimately these are the people behind September 11th and many other horrific crimes. And as Muslims, we have the duty to speak the truth about this. You know, my website, Truth Jihad, refers to the hadith that the best jihad is a word of truth flung in the face of an oppressor. This today, when weapons are so destructive, fighting regular wars is a dubious thing to do in most circumstances, because you're going to have to kill civilians, which you're not supposed to do. You're going to destroy infrastructure, which you're not supposed to do. So what are we supposed to do as Muslims living in such a world dominated by oppressors? Well, we have to wage a truth jihad. We have to tell the truth about what's going on, because when people hear these truths, if they have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to understand, they will join us and rise up and change the system. But we have to do that as Muslims. I just don't see how people can be operating with this riba currency and living comfortably in this corrupt society and letting them murder tens of millions of Muslims over 9/11. And just sit back and live in a nice, comfortable house in the suburbs and pray 5 times a day. And, you're going to have to answer to Allah if you're doing that.
And two of the people who wrote extensively on the issue of banking and the issuance of currency are Eustace Mullins and Edward Griffin. Both have been accused by different things, but the content of that, how money is created, what is money and where does it come from, those are two of the best authors on this issue, Eustace Mullins and Edward Griffin. So are you then connecting that issue of creation of the currency and the compounded interest to the wars? Like how is this connected?
Well, the whole world is connected.
Right.
We have to pay for these wars. We have to pay for the consequences of the wars at home and abroad. Our economy has been diverted to creating weapons of war instead of infrastructure, healthcare. So this is an excellent time to get the truth out to all Americans, because they are seeing so many lies coming from the top down, and they are not seeing the benefits that are accruing to the few, the very wealthy. I benefit when the stock market goes up. It goes up because the government is printing money and giving money to these big corporations that drives the stock up.
Right.
But the average person is hurting badly.
Right. I don't think the average person is benefiting from the
They may not see all these connections, but we have the opportunity and a duty, because truth is central to Islam. And if we don't speak up, we are not abiding by one of the primary tenets of Islam.
So let me then ask you this question. You know about COINTELPRO, the FBI operation to undermine the Black liberation movement, for lack of a better term, or the Black rights, basically. I sense, what I see is there has been a reiteration of COINTELPRO post 9/11, but this time against Muslims and immigrants, and including also adding blacks to the mix. What do you think about this?
Absolutely. Yeah. They've been infiltrating the Masaud. The FBI has found con artists in prisons, and they get released from prison and told to pretend to convert to Islam or something. In some cases they are Muslims, and then they're sent into the Masaud to try to set up some poor teenager and get them all excited about the Muslims being killed, and then tape record them saying something about, maybe I'm going to go join ISIS or blow somebody up. And then the FBI swoops down and stops a terror plot that its own informant actually created. And that's been the pattern. Virtually every single supposed Muslim terror plot in America has followed exactly that pattern. Every single one of them has been an FBI terror plot that never would have happened if the FBI informant hadn't created it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I in the early years, I received death threats. And what I've done to people ask me, how come you haven't been targeted yet? What I've done is make a point of everything I say is there at our website. I'm not hiding anything. My background, what I'm saying, what I'm doing, it's all there. And it's better that people hear it from me than from some third party.
Right.
So I think that's what's protected me so far.
So connecting these issues together now, do you think the Muslim organizations are in a position to speak up, or due to the political climate since 9/11 and potential subversion from FBI or other government outfits that their hands are tied for some reason.
See, how those in power control us is by giving us something which we fear will be taken away if we speak up. So this is a decision you have to make for yourself. Are you willing to risk whatever you're getting for the greater good? And this is a choice each one of us has to make. And it's the most difficult choice for those at the top of organizations, because they tend to lose the most.
Right.
They stand to lose the most.
But I think that if there are any Muslims watching this who would like to become more active in struggling against evil, that the way to frame this is to say, look, we're actually patriotic American citizens.
Right.
I think the internet.
Our religion teaches us to.
Yeah.
And so. Right, we're defending the United States by trying to make it a better place by exposing these crimes so that the system can be repaired. We're not evil foreign terrorists who hate America. On the contrary, we are trying to be good citizens. And when a crime like 9/11 happens and it leads to all of these terrible consequences, it's our duty as Americans who care about this country to try to make it right. And if we take that approach, it makes it a lot harder for them to try to claim that we're, crazy, dangerous foreign radicals.
Right. Have any of you spoken with, Enver, you spoke with heads of some Muslim organizations. Anything happened recently, or it was back then during the fear and the war campaigns?
Nothing recently, because I've written a few articles putting the Muslim leadership in the spotlight for not speaking up.
Right.
So it doesn't tend to help them speak up.
Right.
It's going to be up to the rank and file to get their organizations to speak up. Because
how do you see that speaking up? Like, what do we do?
Well, there's a mosque near here. I won't say which one. They had me over several times to speak to their mosque, and it was a relatively small mosque. It was in a strip mall, and they were very brave. They had me over. They had another person over that I know back in the days of the first Gulf War. But then they wanted to build a bigger mosque, and for that they needed approval, county approval, and all sorts of things, and to pacify the neighbors. Then they stopped talking they haven't stopped talking to me, but they stopped inviting me to speak anymore because they want to build a mosque. And I understand that. So I can't say, well, don't build your mosque, speak out and cut your own throat. That's hard to say.
No, I definitely understand. I'm just trying to find out what can really be done. And it's not only Muslims. Muslims are what? 1%, even 3% at the highest number of the population. What can people of conscience who know that the original story, the official story, is not true, what can they do?
Well, we may be a very small percentage, but it only takes 50 to 100 Muslims in each state writing to their congressmen and senators. They could get information from Kevin Barrett from our website. Write to them, you're a congressman, you're a senator. And if 50 to 100 organize and increase those numbers, that would have a tremendous effect.
Right.
We don't have to, you can say, well, the Jewish community is a lot larger numbers. How do they manage to? Besides having money and all that, there are a lot of poor Jews also, but they're organized. They have they can be more united because they have fewer things to disagree about. Indian Muslims and Pakistani Muslims have different outlooks. Right. So we have many more issues that we disagree on, possibly, but we can all agree that getting the truth out will benefit all Americans, not just Muslims.
Right. So Kevin, the truth comes out, and then what? What happens?
That's a good question. That's exactly the question that Rabbi Michael Lerner addressed in the book I edited along with John Cobb. It's called 9/11 in American Empire, Volume 2, Jews, Christians, and Muslims Speak Out. And Rabbi Lerner, who initially was reluctant to do a hard-hitting 9/11 truth essay, but finally did after I kept urging him to, titled his essay something like, "Okay, so we proved 9/11 was an inside job, then what?" And he argued that it could be an opportunity to shake things up and change the world. And I agree with that. In the same way that these horrific crises like 9/11 or coronavirus are used as an excuse to change the world by the bad guys, to change the world in the wrong way, in the wrong direction, make it worse, as Naomi Klein wrote in her book, The Shock Doctrine. They shock whole societies in order to push through changes that benefit the billionaire elite and hurt everybody else. So a huge kind of shocking challenge can open up a society to being, have its path changed. It can move on to a different track and go a different direction. And I think if 9/11 is exposed in such a way that the authorities, the mainstream media, the politicians have to admit it, I think that we will have a chance to move on to a better track, as Rabbi Lerner wrote in that essay. That is, militarism will, the military in wars will be discredited. We'll learn that they have to lie to us to make us go to war. Zionism, especially extreme Zionism, will be discredited, and Israel will have to go to sue for peace. And I think people all over the world would wake up and recognize that, that we've been manipulated by these very unscrupulous elites for centuries or more. And if they got away with this big of a lie, and now we see it, maybe we're going to be going into the future with a different attitude, and it'll be a lot harder for them to do it again.
So a lot of people compare the Kennedy assassination to 9/11. Of course, different magnitudes, but magnitudes of events, but still, it's the mystery that's still lingering. There is no official conclusion to what really happened, except, of course, like something like the 9/11 Commission report, which the two heads of the commission themselves wrote a book after saying that they were lied to and set to fail and this and that. Do you see that 9/11 will become like the real facts will become exposed, considering that we do not have a final conclusion of the Kennedy assassination yet?
Well, I think it'd be more like the Gulf of Tonkin so-called incident. The Hiroshima bombing, will continue to argue about it for a long time. But enough people will realize what's been really happening, and hopefully that'll lead to change.
So then in this case, do you see that electoral politics is the way, electing good people?
Look at what happened with this recent Black Lives Movement. It was one killing that exposed a truth that had been known to the Black community and many others for many, many years. It's nothing new. But that one incident crystallized it.
Right.
COVID crisis has crystallized the sorry state of our healthcare system.
Right.
So all we can do is try to move to creating that sort of atmosphere and hope some good will come out of that.
Very good. So I want to use the last few minutes to give each of you an opportunity to give your final thoughts before we end this program. This is going to be a huge 2-hour special. I appreciate you coming on. Please, Dr. Kevin, if you can give us your final thoughts on the issue, summarizing what we spoke about and what you see the next steps should be.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the JFK assassination, and we should remember that the official U.S. government position is that it was a conspiracy. There were two commissions. There was the Warren Commission in 1963 and 64, and then there was a second commission in the 1970s that said it was a conspiracy. That was the House Special Investigations and Assassinations Commission, and its official conclusion was that it was a conspiracy involving organized crime, but we don't know the details. Okay, but look at all the good that did. Really, it's more, as Philip Zelikow, the myth maker, knows, it's really more a matter of public perception than official reality or even any kind of reality. And so I think we need to keep pushing back against the people of the lie at every level. Ron Unz of unz.com, a website which has all kinds of interesting non-official perspectives. He's done great work on a long list of issues, including 9/11, and he pushes a strategy of fighting skirmishes against the mainstream media. He thinks the weak link in the chain of these power mongers and brainwashers is the mainstream media, which more and more people doubt. So if we can keep helping people remember and alerting them to the fact that the story they're getting in the mainstream media about everything is fundamentally wrong and incomplete. And as we move into the post-Donald Trump era, inshallah, we'll have to keep pushing that, because they're going to say Trump is the, guys like Trump doubt the media, but he was terrible, and now we should all believe the media again. We need to go, all out, exposing this long list of the most important issues where the establishment is lying to us through the media. And we have the internet, and whether we can keep the internet free to talk about these issues and inform people about the truth about these issues is going to be a really important deciding factor, I think, in how this battle all turns out. But down the line, and maybe within our lifetimes, inshallah, or maybe after, I still have hope that the people of truth and the followers of the prophets, who are all the people of truth, who are willing to stand by the truth, even if they're going to be persecuted by the mullah and the powerful people in their society, that ultimately the people of truth are going to prevail in this life and or certainly the next.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. And Enver, your final thoughts?
Well, I want to again say this book is available free as an ebook on the internet. Just Google it.
9/11 Unveiled.
If you click on the ebook, which is free, the hard copy you have to buy at a store, you click on the section headings, and it takes you all this evidence we've been talking about. And I'll make another offer to your audience. If you wish to send this to your congressman, your senator, your governor, your key media person, send me a stamped envelope, and I will insert this book free in there and send it on for you. So I'll make this offer to all your public to send as many copies as required to key person. Just send me a stamped envelope with your own return address on it.
So this book is called 9/11 Unveiled. It's available on the website twf.org, which is the Wisdom Fund website, and they can find your address on the website there.
There's a button labeled contact. You can just click on that.
Very well. And final thoughts on what next steps should be?
Well, as we spoke earlier, I am willing to help in any way I can to spread what I know about 9/11. And if some mosque or Muslim organization needs speakers, I'm sure Kevin will be available, although he seems to be a very busy person. And I might be tempted to go out, except that flying nowadays is not recommended.
Right.
You have to have some alternative ways of doing it. Your medium, Zoom, etc. There are many ways of handling this.
Right. So I want to thank you so much for coming on Vantage Points and giving us your experience and your knowledge and your years of research and activism in that field. I believe, like, we're almost 2 hours. This could fill a book by itself if it's transcribed. There is so much information. We covered the incident itself, the different acts on the day of 9/11, who benefited from 9/11, potential benefactors, even the money factors, the put options in the stock market. And we covered almost every aspect. And I mean, we could speak for another 2 hours because, the topic is still open, but I looking forward to having you again in the future. Anytime you would like to come and talk about it, please just let me know. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our episode tonight. There are hashtags and there is a hashtag. This is the hashtag. Take care, America.
Thank you.